Welcome to Issues with Noah Rothman on Two-Way. I'm your host, Noah Rothman. And today, we begin with Joe Biden's quote-unquote anger over Israel's conduct of its defensive war against Hamas. According to maybe a dozen reports from journalists who are privy to what the White House wants us to know, anger is the emotion that has come to dominate the White House among its staff and even the president, given what they've been seeing out of Israel and specifically the conduct of the war in Gaza. That peak is especially pronounced today in the wake of a botched airstrike that accidentally targeted aid workers with the group World Central Kitchen this week. The strike is being investigated by Israeli officials, but the lack of a definitive report is no obstacle to Israeli officials issuing mea culpas. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said this week that he deeply regrets the airstrikes. Israeli Chief of Staff Hezi Halavi joined him in apologizing for the, quote, unintentional harm caused by those strikes. Still, the strikes are being framed by Israel's critics as all but a deliberate exercise. This was not just a bad luck situation, said WCK founder and celebrity chef Jose Anders. Quote, what I know is that we were targeted deliberately, nonstop until everybody was dead. Francesca Albanese, the UN special rapporteur of the, quote, occupied Palestinian territory, seems to agree. My assessment is that the Israeli forces intentionally killed WCK workers so that donors would pull out and civilians in Gaza could continue to be starved quietly, she said. It's a pretty dastardly plot, but one that makes almost no sense. The allegation here is that Jerusalem is playing a very long game by allowing WCK to operate inside Gaza for months, only so that one day it could engineer a gigantic embarrassment for itself. Typically, conspiracy theorists would feel compelled to at least establish a facially plausible quid pro quo that explains why the executors of their vast plots have something resembling a motive. But when it comes to Israel, the conspiracists feel no such compunction. The Biden administration's anger has not prevented the White House from provisioning Israel with all the material aid it needs to conduct this war, which has led many observers to fairly conclude that the Biden administration wants you to think rhetorically that they have a problem with the Netanyahu government, whereas their actions betray their genuine support for the administration. That has given them done them no favors, among Israel's critics, particularly those on the far left, including some former members of the Obama administration. Among them, former National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes, who called the administration to use this event, the attack on this convoy, to stop the shipment of certain ordnance that it needs to conduct the war that have nothing to do with that attack on that particular convoy. Makes you wonder whether the issue is the attack on the convoy or Israel's conduct of the war itself. And if Israel's critics are mad, so too are Israel's supporters, who have become increasingly impatient with the Biden administration's fair weather rhetoric. They've all urged some caution here, deservedly, but they maintain that while the administration has adopted a different posture in public when it comes to trying to appease the malcontents on the left who are frustrated with Israel's criticism, they are supposed to internalize all this as a delicate dance that's not for their benefit. They are supposed to understand, Israel supporters, that the Biden administration is engaged in a little bit of sleight of hand to appease the unappeasable activists on the left, while they are simply supposed to sit back and understand they need to compartmentalize what the Biden administration is doing. If they want to have their cake and eat it too, it shouldn't necessarily be all on Israel's supporters to understand that this is not for their benefit. It's a double standard. It's one that certainly can engender some hostility, deservedly so. And I would say that if the Biden administration wants to be seen as being hostile to Israel, who are we to argue with the administration? Joining me today to help me make sense of the schizophrenia that's characterized the Biden administration's approach to Israel, I'm very pleased to be joined by my two guests, Josh Kraushaar, editor-in-chief of Jewish Insider and a Fox News political analyst, and Rebecca Heinrichs, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute specializing in national defense. Thank you both for being here. I sincerely appreciate it. Josh, let's begin with you. Quote, Biden is pissed. The temperature regarding Bibi is very high. That's what we heard from Axios reporter Barak Ravid today, ahead of Joe Biden's call with Netanyahu. And after that call, the president demanded an immediate ceasefire. That's something that Joe Biden has said in the past he would like to see extended indefinitely if he had his way. Functionally, Joe Biden has now abandoned his support for Israel, right? if we're supposed to absorb this rhetoric and take it seriously, as the administration seems to want us to do, Joe Biden has advocated that Hamas will not be neutralized, that it will remain a political and military force on the Gaza Strip, that it has no interest in giving up these hostages necessarily, unless some miracle happens, and Hamas survives. Therefore, Hamas wins. Israel loses. Am I wrong?
Well, look, I think it's important to separate the rhetoric from the substance, and that's what's making my head spin. And it's making a lot of people on all sides trying to follow this debate, trying to figure out where the foreign policy ends and where the politics begins. And I think the rhetoric has been so overwhelmingly, as you point out, Noah, critical of Israel that we've almost lost track. And frankly, the American public, especially Democrats, have lost track of who the enemy is. That Hamas is the perpetrator. They hide civilians and embed them, or hide terrorists and embed them in civilian areas. They enjoy seeing as many civilian casualties as possible. And the less you hear the White House talking about the fundamental goal of this war that Israel has been waging against Hamas, to oust them from the Gaza Strip, to remove them from leadership, and to create a more stable and normal body politic. But that doesn't happen until you defeat Hamas. And the more rhetoric you hear, and boy, the last 2 weeks, Noah, has been sort of a chorus of condemnation against Israel, of tutting Israel for its handling of, not doing enough to have any kind of humanitarian concern for the Palestinian civilians, and concern over hunger and famine potentially in the Gaza Strip. I think the White House would be a lot better off with a clearer message, having a politics that aligned with the policy. And I think they've kind of created a real political problem, frankly, for themselves. I mean, and that's what my background is looking at public opinion, and public opinion among Democrats has dipped considerably in supporting Israel's military operation. And a lot of it has coincided with sort of the criticism that you're hearing from the podium, both today, but also in recent weeks. At the same time, like that puts the White House in a box. It almost accelerates the pressure. It incentivizes the activists that are, frankly, a fairly small faction of the Democratic Party voting electorate, but it's emboldening them to protest Biden, to attack him. You're not the Arab activists in Dearborn are not going to accept these half loaves, these what I would call conditions on conditions. That's not going to satisfy them. So you're not going to win over the people who are not going to support you, or are threatening to stay home, or vote third party. And then you're worrying the moderates, the silent, what I call the silent majority of both moderate Democratic voters, the John Fetterman types, who has been pretty stalwart in Pennsylvania on behalf of Israel, and condemning, frankly, the Biden administration for being a little weak-kneed here, but also, just the overall independent and Republican vote that is going to be so crucial for the president in re-election.
We'll get back to the domestic politics of that, not only emboldening the protesters, by the way, but giving Hamas no reason to negotiate. Why would they, if all the pressure is on Israel? Rebecca, the Biden administration wants Israel's critics to see the president as angry over Israel's conduct. They're hoping Israel's far more numerous supporters in the United States, as Josh just said, will compartmentalize it and emphasize instead his support for Israel in material terms. That assumes Israel's backers are capable of far more discretion than its critics. I mean, maybe that's true, but it's an insult. It's an insult to the intelligence of both Israel supporters and its critics. Why should Jerusalem's backers be expected to endure this double standard? If Biden wants to be seen as unsupportive of Israel's war with Hamas, why should we argue with them?
Right. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, I think, first of all, I think it's important to look at what the incident is that has caused this new degree of condemnation from the White House. This was the World Central Kitchen terrible tragedy where these workers, these 8 workers, 7 of them were tragically killed immediately. The Israeli government, as you said, Noah, came out and lamented that it happened. I think that's exactly right. I think that there's no rational reason to suggest that Israel did this on purpose. I understand the grief of those who are making that they're grieved, those who are saying that they believe this was on purpose. But if you look at the course of the entire war, and this is what John Kirby has said. John Kirby from the podium, the White House podium, has said, look, we've got people from the State Department who are watching everything that Israel does to make sure that they are complying with international law in the way they conduct this war. We have found no violation of international law in the way they're conducting this war. So this incident is tragic. It is terrible. It's also remarkable that it's so infrequent, considering what the IDF is actually dealing with in Gaza. So I think that's first of all it's actually really awful that this is the moment that the White House is choosing to make this point now that the president is so supposedly so angry with the way that what Israel has conducted itself. So when people ask me, what do I think about the White House's or that the administration's views and policy on Israel, I say, well, which are you talking about President Biden, what his people are saying, or are you talking about what John Kirby is saying? Because if you listen to what John Kirby is saying, it actually comports a lot more closely with the policy, with the administration's continued support from a policy perspective, the weapons that it wants to provide Israel. And obviously, it's not actually pressuring in a real sense the Israeli government to stop the war. They can't. Israel is going to, because Israel's not going to stop. They're going to continue this military campaign until they've eliminated Hamas entirely. And one last point I want to make is really important that people understand what it is. I think sometimes it's sort of like we assume that everybody remembers what it is that Israel's trying to do. I mean, 300 miles of underground tunnels in Gaza, 200 feet underground.
That they could simply do what they always did, which is retreat to their strongholds and wait it out, and they would have plenty of time to reconstitute themselves. Didn't play out this time like they expected, but they had every reason to believe that the international community would do exactly what Joe Biden is doing today, pressure Israel to let Hamas survive.
Right. So we know the Clausewitzian remark that that war is politics by other means. Well, in democracies, foreign policy is domestic politics by other means. And Hamas understands that. And so they're playing to what they perceive as weaknesses in, liberal democratic societies. So they're playing to these audiences, these voters who are very already sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, to the cause of those in Gaza, and then really by extension Hamas, because Hamas is the one that is most responsible for the current situation of Gazans and civilians there. So, I'd like to make the point too, to really wrap your mind around this. It is not just that Hamas utilizes human shields. These shields are, it's actually, they're using civilians with the full realization and full intent that they will die. So it's not even just that they're shields. It's like they're pushing them forward in front of themselves in order that they will die, so that they can really humiliate the Israeli government and then create this uproar in these open societies in order to get our leaders to put pressure on Israel to stop so that they can continue to exist. So it's really horrible. I mean, it's really terrible the way Hamas is seeking to maximize human suffering for its own military political gain. And that the hospital situation is like just a perfect example of even though they're actually even trying to get civilian casualties, like they want Israel to kill these most vulnerable, already injured, sick people in this hospital. It's like they want them to die, and the IDF even was able to evacuate them and not give Hamas exactly what they wanted. 6,000 civilians evacuated. I know that, Hamas reported that some people died in the hospital. Well, it's like that sick people are in the hospital. So I would imagine.
Oh, they maintained that the people that Israel wasn't summarily executing, they were starving, depriving of water. A lot of conduct that you think there would be more independent reporting of.
Well, then there's no, and furthermore, Israel understands it's under the world's most critical magnifying glass right now. So it's like, it doesn't make any sense that they would be doing these horrible things that would be so out of character with the way they have fought and actually been restrained for decades. So it doesn't make any sense. But that entire retaking of the hospital, going in there and killing those Hamas fighters and getting those civilians evacuated from there, I mean, it's a testament to how Israel is conducting itself in this war.
Josh, if you have any insight on the Shifa Hospital siege, please share it. But what does your reporting and Jewish Insider's reporting tell us about the stalled assault on Rafah? Are we simply at a point at which we're just waiting for Ramadan to close out? There's the sticking point about civilians, where the White House doesn't want civilians to be relocated, but also wants to make sure that every effort is maintained to ensure civilian safety, which is kind of a catch-22. What's the state of play ahead of the Rafah siege?
Well, I think there are a lot of considerations. Number one is the timetable in which, if you talk to Israeli military officials, it'll take at least 4 weeks to accomplish the humanitarian prerequisites to clear the area, to evacuate civilians, and that has not begun. So I don't see a Rafah operation taking place anytime until like the late spring at the earliest. And if you listen to some political commentators in Israel that are kind of, in the center left, maybe, they are skeptical that, they view Bibi's rhetoric about Rafah. And I don't know if I agree with this, but they actually view it as his way of keeping his coalition together and making sure that is seen as sort of a way to kind of maintain the broadest possible coalition in Israel.
Can you elaborate on what that rhetoric is? What is he saying? Well, we're going to go in and these commentators don't believe that's true?
We have two red lines, right? I mean, you have a red line in the U.S. that the president has set that basically says you can't go into Rafah unless you accomplish certain humanitarian conditions, the evacuation in a way that we haven't laid out, but we haven't seen anything from the Israeli side that shows that there's been enough of that taken into consideration. And on the Israeli side, you basically say we're going into Rafah no matter what, and it's hard to square that circle, right? And I think there actually is a lot of kind of behind the scenes conversations taking place about how to accomplish the operation. But there also is, I think, buying time, like you said, Noah. This is not going to happen right away, and there's a lot of other military activity, as we've been talking about, taking place. Look, on the political track for the Netanyahu and the war cabinet, I think one of two things need to happen for Israelis to think that they at least have come close to winning the war. I mean, number one is taking out Sinwar, the Hamas leadership, and hold up in Rafah and having a kind of a denouement in Rafah and having the bad guys taken out, right? Or number two is seeing the hostages released and alive, and that would, I mean, there's if you follow Israeli politics, there is this divide that's emerging between sort of the center left that puts more priority on getting the hostages released in good condition, and another half that wants to win the war and finish off Hamas in Rafah. And you're starting to see some partisanship return in Israel over those kind of that dynamic.
Hey, Josh, what has been the reaction to the protests of the hostage families?
Well, it depends on what hostage families you're talking to. Certainly, Uh, Look, I mean that's sort of that's sort of the challenge in trying to talk about Israeli politics. There's all the paradox of Israeli politics, Noah, right now is that Israelis are have a very negative view towards Bibi Netanyahu, but they're also very security conscious and they're very right wing in terms of like they want to win the war. They want Israel to continue fighting the war until Hamas is defeated. That's an overwhelmingly popular decision, even among voters who are no fans of Bibi Netanyahu. And that has been the fundamental mistake that the Biden administration has made, that Chuck Schumer, frankly, has made in recent weeks by trying to personalize the war in Bibi's name, not appreciating the fact that if you look at Israeli public opinion polls, 80% or so of Israelis are supportive of the war. They want to finish off Hamas in Rafah, and they want to have a clear victory and not have Israel vulnerable amid a rapid retreat.
All right. So before we zoom out or the region, go back to focusing on Washington, Rebecca, also at the same time, almost the same day at least, as this horrific attack on these aid workers in Gaza, Israel struck a consulate informally in Damascus, occupied by Iranian forces, killing at least 2 high-ranking Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps members. All eyes are now on the north of Israel, where most Israelis have been evacuated since October 7th, roughly. And there's been a low-level conflict between IDF forces and Hezbollah. And some suspect that this tempo is set to increase, or perhaps worse, once Iran has commemorated its dead. Is that what you expect? What's to keep Iran in line, save the naval assets that are deployed in the Levant, or is that deterrent force no longer having the deterrent effect that it has previously had?
Well, I would say right now, Iran's strategy to continue to essentially wage this war via proxy has worked out really well for it. So I don't really I don't see Iran making the foolish decision to come right out and be directly involved in the conflict at this point.
I think the fear is a conflagration involving Hezbollah.
Exactly.
Which is deniable.
Right. So and
Of trouble. And maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm wondering about the race in Nevada for U.S. Senate Nevada with Jackie Rosen. She's one of the most outspoken pro-Israel lawmakers in the Democratic caucus in the Senate, almost Fetterman-esque in her support for Israel's cause, but she's also facing a Republican who is as or more pro-Israel, and the war is featured prominently in a race that shouldn't otherwise be about foreign policy. There are about 80,000 Jews in Nevada. They punch way above their weight, typically splitting their votes, as far as I understand it. And a little bit of a shift is enough to really move that race, which has just been recharacterized by the Cook Political Report as a toss-up. Now, I have no evidence to suggest this has everything to do with the movement of Nevada's Jewish population, but I suspect it might be. Am I wrong? Are my suspicions completely myopic and solipsistic?
Let's take things one piece at a time.
Sure.
Look, the race is not just Nevada, but Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. The races where you have lawmakers that have the most politically to lose. Those are the Democratic lawmakers that are the most pro-Israel. They are not the ones screaming ceasefire. They're not the ones calling for conditioning aid. So if you want to know where the overall public opinion is on Israel, just look at the battleground. Even in Michigan, I mean, Mike Rogers is that may be the one area where it's toughest to keep a strong pro-Israel position. The Republican, very strong leading candidate there, Mike Rogers, running an unequivocally pro-Israel message. And even the Democrat, Alyssa Slotkin, Congresswoman, is trying to straddle the line between appeasing the kind of Arab and Muslim and college campus communities in the state, along with the substantial Jewish vote also in Michigan. You go to Pennsylvania, though, where you have a whole lot more pro-Israel and Jewish voters in the state. You have John Fetterman, you have Governor Josh Shapiro, you've got Brendan Boyle in Congress. You got a whole lineup of Democrats that are to the right of Joe Biden, if you call it that, in terms of taking a pro-Israel position. And you read my mind, Noah. You can look in Democratic primaries, contested Democratic primaries featuring high-profile members of the squad facing serious challenges for the first time, a lot of them over Israel. And Jamal Bowman, if you believe Mark Mellman's polling, is losing by 17 points. Cori Bush is losing.
I want to believe that, but it's one of those, too good to be true kind of things.
Well, I mean, look, I always, in any internal poll, take with a grain of salt. I rarely see any incumbent in the 30s before. Right. Well, that's a really bad position to be in. So if you don't believe Mark Mellman's polling, that's one thing. But if you think the numbers are in the ballpark, it's a really bad place for Jamal Bowman to be in. Cori Bush down over 20 points, according to an independent poll taken last month. There's a big race in Pennsylvania coming up with Summer Lee, which may be an even more telling bellwether, because pro-Israel groups have actually not all engaged in that race. They're cautious. They don't want to put all their chips on the table, but that'll be an interesting test to see, in a race where you're not getting outside support, where that squad aligned lawmaker is going to land. So look, I mean, the tea leaves are not just taking place in swing states and battlegrounds across the country, but when you have Democratic primaries in very blue parts of the country, where being pro-Israel is seen as the more popular position. Now, you're not going to see that in Dearborn. You're not going to see that in some parts of like urban areas. There's certainly there's a sense of division within the Democratic coalition, but the vast majority of Democrats, broadly speaking, have a very pro-Israel orientation.
Yeah. So Rebecca, the last polling I've seen suggests that overall broad support for Israel per se is on the decline among Americans, particularly among Democrats. But if you ask them, these same voters, if you ask them, should Hamas remain the power in charge in Gaza, they say no. They say, well, if we should we continue
the oppressed, and this is what people who are oppressed and don't have as much power, they're allowed to use these horrible tactics against those who are strong and the oppressor. And, that was really, really pronounced right after October 7th in a terrible, kind of frightening way. And then if you're seeing now that actually in a lot of these swing states that view is simply not, it has not metastasized as a general ideological bent, that really there are pockets of folks who are registered Democrats who might still be against Israel, but it doesn't seem to be sort of a viewpoint that is part of this larger sort of ideological movement to support these terrorist groups, in particular Hamas. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to put that out there because that's very interesting to me and encouraging if it does intend to be the case. I thought it was also worth pointing out, when Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, went all the way to Puerto Rico in order to gain supporters there because of the Puerto Ricans who are here in the United States in battleground states. She wanted to make sure that they would vote the right way when the election came. And she goes to Puerto Rico and found pro-Hamas people in Puerto Rico who were protesting her and the president and calling him Genocide Joe, burning the American flag. And so for me, I'm still pretty concerned in tracking this sort of fervent anti-Israel sentiment, but it would be interesting if what Josh says is correct.
And no, if I can just follow up here, like broadly, I want to be a little more detailed about how I kind of look at the Democratic primary electorate these days. It does overlap a lot with the the wokeness issues that ended up sort of being the bark was a lot louder than the actual bite in electoral politics. And I think we're seeing a similar dynamic here with both pro-Israel, anti-Israel dynamic in the Democratic Party. I would split the Democratic Party into thirds. No, or three parts, not evenly split three parts, but you have the loudest anti-Israel faction, even pro-Hamas in some instances. When you see the protests on the campuses, that's the left-wing urban areas. It's the college campuses. It's Dearborn. It's the Arab and Muslim American communities where there are high levels of anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Semitism, and that's I think still a fairly small share of the overall Democratic electorate. Then you've got the pro-Israel community, Jewish voters, moderate voters. That used to be the dominant faction in the party. I would say the outspoken pro-Israel sentiment is much smaller than it used to be, but it still is larger than the extreme left. And then I think you have maybe like 60, 70% of the party that's kind of in the mushy middle, where they support Israel generally, but they're uncomfortable seeing the scenes of what's happening in Gaza. I call if you watch Morning Joe on MSNBC, like that, there was one moment they're kind of condemning all the anti-Semitism in the country and saying Israel does what it needs to do to defeat Hamas. But then when the elite pressure and you have all the civilian tolls add up, then they get wobbly. And I think that's what we're seeing generally with that larger share of voters in the Democratic Party. These are not single issue Israel voters. These are people who are not going to vote on Middle East policy. They're not going to vote uncommitted in primaries. But they're the ones that are going a little softer on over what's going on in the Middle East.
Just as somebody who votes on foreign policy generally, I find it hard to believe that foreign policy would matter at all. It typically does not, unless one of two factors are present, or both, that Americans are coming home in body bags, or the United States has been humiliated abroad in some fashion or form. But it does seem to be especially relevant in our modern political discourse. So with that heartening news, let's pivot from the Israel conflict to the war in Ukraine. Speaker Mike Johnson will reportedly take another crack at approving Ukraine aid when Congress reconvenes. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is how I understand the new structure of this package. According to what we've heard from reports and from the White House, which is apparently working hand in glove with Mike Johnson to get this over the finish line, the new attempt will structure this as an interest-free forgivable loan, which is atypical, but sort of how we used to do aid packages back in the 80s and 90s. Not very recently, but it's not necessarily something that's going to satisfy the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, who also today called it a steaming pile of BS, or I think that was yesterday. But it will satisfy Trump if he's to take him at his word, because this is a Trump idea. It would also include the Repo Act, which would have perhaps some unintended consequences, repossessing some Russian assets and redistributing them to Ukraine to offset costs. But that's something Ukraine hawks have advocated for some time. None of this is very controversial, but what is is this notion that the bill would force Biden to cave on his backdoor liquid natural gas export ban, the limited approval of new export terminals, which is functionally cover for putting downward pressure on liquid natural gas exports. So, Rebecca, Biden would have to accept this, right? The new policy is to appease the Greens, climate activists, but is totally counterproductive, not just for our own economic interests, but for the war in general. Biden himself argued at the outset of Russia's second invasion of Ukraine that Russian energy extortionism in the European continent needed to be combated, and the only way to combat that was to increase our own exports. But so it seems like this is a chip that Biden is willing to trade away. But does it appease the right? They've said that they don't object necessarily to providing for Ukraine's defense, which I've been assured that's not the case. They actually do want to support Ukraine, just not in the particular ways that have been on offer. So is this the one that will successfully thread the needle, Rebecca?
Well, first, this issue kind of really frustrates me with the way that it covers it for a couple of big reasons here. One, I've been tracking and working on and analyzing the Russia threat for many, many years, and also the dynamics politically of who supports taking a tougher approach toward versus a softer approach, favoring diplomacy versus hard power, et cetera. And everything's kind of backwards when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, and for several big reasons. But on this, the most pressing issue, and now kind of moving forward, Johnson, first of all, has been consistent from the beginning. So before he was speaker, all the way now, he has continued to say basically two things: we want to help Ukraine, and we want to make sure that Russia is not rewarded for its aggression against Ukraine. So he has been consistent there. The confusion, the frustration for somebody like me who actually believes it's very much in U.S. interest to support Ukraine and make sure that Ukraine can actually repel Russia out of its territory and stop Russia from further aggression. It's been very, very frustrating that Speaker Johnson doesn't have the support without being threatened that they'll take his gavel, that he'll immediately lose his ability to be Speaker of the House if he does bring up Ukraine aid. And that's really been, Marjorie Taylor Greene's threat, that's what she'll do. And she's made, Ukraine sort of the issue, the wedge issue for her. If the White House really wanted, it says it wants to support Ukraine. I mean, what Speaker Johnson, what has been publicly reported, this is a great deal, actually. It gets the Biden administration out of this bind. It can say, listen, we support democracy over autocracy. We support Ukraine. We need to get this package through. I mean, these, letting LNG go forward, it was the price that we had to pay to get this package through. And it's actually sound policy anyway. And Biden can, he can turn to the environmentalists and say, basically, like, my hands were tied. I had to do this for this other policy issue that was a priority. I mean, so what Speaker Johnson reportedly is asking for is entirely reasonable and also completely consistent with the things that Republicans have been demanding be included in a package that they support. So the Repo Act is actually super clever. I mean, this is basically like, Trump saying that he's going to make Mexico pay for the wall. Repo is, we're going to make the corrupt Russian oligarchs pay for this war that the Russian government has committed, and it's about $300 billion worth of frozen sovereign Russian assets. The U.S. has access independently to about $5 billion of it. But if you include repo, the U.S. seizes that $5 billion. You're going to have the Europeans follow. And then we've got this windfall of frozen Russian assets that can be used for the economic rebuild of Ukraine. Really smart, I think, for Johnson to try to push to include this. The challenge is going to be, it's got Israel funding in there. It's got Israel funding in there too. So can he keep enough Democrats on board with the Israel support also, and get enough of his own party? I think he has credibly satisfied a lot of their concerns. We can go through some of those other ones too, where he should be able to get sort of the reasonable, persuaded Republicans, obviously the national security hawks, those who are stronger. He's never going to get Marjorie Taylor Greene and the dozen or so people who think like her and use her kind of rhetoric. So I think he's going to do it. I think it's possible, and I think he's got the support. But the wild card's going to be, is the White House going to actually play ball rather than play politics on this, and are we going to keep Democrats on board to pass it?
Yeah, they seem to know they need it. Briefly, Rebecca, because you seem very up on the Repo Act. The opposition to it, from what I've heard, which is largely theoretical and slippery slope, but nevertheless about the uncertainties of the precedent that would be set here, is that the reacquisition of these assets, the summary acquisition of these assets, opens Western assets up to similar reprisals that are abroad in the event of a conflict, and everybody's looking in China's direction and saying, well, if we were to set this precedent, it will come to bite us back pretty hard come the very near future in the event of a conflict in the South China Sea. Is that something that people should be concerned about?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that, I understand the logic there, but it's also interesting not to use logical fallacy. If my kids are here, they point this out. But, it is interesting, though, that the people who are opposing this are also people who tend to be more dovish on China. These tend to be more the libertarian types, those who don't want the administration to take a tougher approach to China. And so it's just interesting that, you kind of run into the same folks who are nervous on the economic front. I mean, listen, if the United States is going to war with China over something like Taiwan, I don't think we're going to be, of course, China's going to use all the tools it can possibly use to win the information war space and to do everything it can. It's going to use all of its tools of economic power to harm the United States. I think that's not even going to be the worst of our worries if that comes to pass. The reason that repo, I think, is so smart right now is because you would have support from all of these Western countries would be on board with doing this. And so we collectively would be doing something that we haven't done before. And it's in order to make sure that, that Russia, again, let me put it this way, somebody's going to pay for Ukraine's rebuild at the end of this conflict. It's either going to be Western democracies or it's going to be the Russians. And this is a way to say to the American taxpayer, listen, we're not going to fund both sides of this war. Speaker Johnson has said we're going to try to also increase sanctions on Russia as well to cut off the Russian war machine. We're going to help Ukraine get lethal aid, et cetera. But we're also going to make sure that American taxpayers are not in any way going to be footed with this bill to rebuild Ukraine. And it's going to be at the foot of the Russians. So again, if the people who are the most concerned about this tend to be those who want us to take a softer approach anyway and not get engaged in sort of these economic challenges with the Chinese.
Fair enough. Josh, let's put on our cynical hats, very cynical. The small but very effective caucus of conference of Republicans who are hostile to leadership, hostile to Ukraine, hostile to just about anything that isn't maximalist MAGA politics. They seem really more jazzed about policing Republicans than they are opposing Democrats. It's hard to avoid that impression. So if this is all negative partisanship, and I think a lot of it is negative partisanship, by substituting the globalist pro-Ukraine war-mongering hawks, right, with the climate change activists in the Democratic Party who are opposed to this, lifting this liquid natural gas ban, that's a sound strategy. It's sort of like an Indiana Jones switcheroo where we substitute one object of hatred for another object of hatred. At least it would be if these Republicans are really more psychologically satisfied by assailing their own than they are attacking Democrats, or rather that would be the obstacle, right? If they get more satisfaction from attacking Republicans, then they would continue to oppose this because they like attacking Republicans more than they like attacking Democrats.
Yeah.
But could it be effective? Could it be effective to substitute the climate hawks as the object of their ire?
Well, I wanted to take one step back. I think there's some smart legislative politics taking place right now, and Mike Johnson, I do not think is the roadblock. I think it's members of his caucus, as Rebecca was pointing out. He's got a narrow majority. You've got more than just Marjorie Taylor Greene really raising holy hell against giving money to Ukraine. And if you look at some of the recent votes on past resolutions dealing with Ukraine aid, over half of the Republican caucus is now fundamentally in some way skeptical or critical of Ukraine aid. And that's a fundamental challenge. I'll give you one data point, because politics is the study of public opinion. And one of the most recent Senate primaries in one of the biggest, most important states in the country, Ohio, Sherrod Brown facing a serious challenge for reelection, Republicans had a choice to nominate a challenger to Senator Brown. You had two of the three leading candidates pro-Ukraine in a state, by the way, that has the largest Ukrainian American population anywhere in the country. The third candidate, who was once more internationalist in mindset, more hawkish in worldview, ran not just against any Ukraine aid, but also had one of his allies attack his opponents for supporting in an ad across the state in supporting aid to Ukraine. That candidate, Bernie Moreno, is now the Republican nominee, winning over 50% of the vote in a Republican primary. So that's the fundamental challenge. I mean, I appreciate, and I think there are reasons to be optimistic. That again, I was very comforted listening to Rebecca talking about some of the legislative mechanisms in which to build a bipartisan coalition, because there are 300 plus votes in the House for Ukraine. I mean, if we had different procedural rules in Congress and we just had a vote. In all likelihood, you could get 2/3, and then maybe that's the vehicle in which some kind of aid to Ukraine and Israel could end up passing. But boy, I mean, the Republican Party I'm seeing now and on the campaign trail and in rhetoric, it's not just it's a lot more than just skepticism of foreign aid. There's a real hostility when you mention certain words that it'll turn off a critical mass of Republican voters.
Can I tack on there? No, real quick. So if you look at this, so I'm from Ohio, and so I tend to get overly interested in what's going on in Ohio these days. And it's frustrating to me because you've actually seen it change. I mean, this primary, I come from very conservative part of the state, and these were Dolan voters, kind of surrounding me. So and he's very pro-Ukraine. So I think there's a couple of things going on here. One, I don't know how much to make of the Ukraine issue, but you're right that Moreno was the one who went really, really hard against Ukraine. But let me just say a few things. The things that Johnson is including in this package, supposedly being reported, and frankly, to McConnell's credit, what Republicans in the Senate also did to the package in order to kind of meet some of these concerns from Republicans, the ones that are not isolationist. So if we're going to divide into two camps, I have perceived this sort of neo-isolationist turn in the Republican Party among the fringe. Those people are like, let's use Marjorie Taylor Greene. I call her a Code Pink Republican because she actually literally protests with the leftist group Code Pink. And they're constantly blaming the United States for the world's problems, and they're always taking the sides of our enemies. Okay, so
that's not figurative, by the way. She literally has said that America is responsible for the war in Ukraine, and America could turn it off like a light switch if it wanted to.
Yeah, I'm being very careful. I'm not sort of demagoguing her. This is what she wants to be associated with Code Pink. She gets her picture taken with Code Pink. These are the words and if you just track her rhetoric, it tracks very, very closely with the isolationist rhetoric that we've heard often from the progressives, blaming the United States for our problems and supporting our enemies. And so this is really a real thing, I think, that is happening. And in the fact that you have, and then I think Senator Vance is another example, tracking pretty closely to that kind of rhetoric and his anti-Ukraine rhetoric. And then you have many of the Republicans who are very supportive of Ukraine. This is where I think Johnson kind of is reflective of, where he said, we want to have a theory of victory for Ukraine. We do not want this to be an open-ended war. We want we want an end to this. We want a limited war in which Ukraine prevails in some sense. And so there's a provision in the supplemental that requires a strategy to do that. I think that's fair. And then there's also, you want the right kind of weapons so that Ukraine can prevail. So actually, Republicans have been pushing for longer range strike systems and for Ukraine to have the ability to use them. That's going against the Biden administration's policy for Ukraine. Anthony Blinken recently came out and said that we don't want Ukraine to be, hitting targets inside of Russia. So, and then the other thing is more oversight and that we're not supporting, Ukrainian pensions. That's already been stripped out of the Senate version. So that's where I'm hopeful. If you can have a Republican get out there and make these arguments from the right with somebody who actually has the credibility of not just being a hawk. And so that's where I think the party is kind of split. And I am hopeful that we can get there. Mike Waltz is another example of a candidate from Florida who's traditionally very hawkish. He wants Ukraine to prevail, but he's got these criteria that he wants to be met so that we're being responsible and not having another endless war where Americans lose because we're essentially kind of unwilling to do what is necessary to support the beleaguered country who's fighting. So you know, I'm tracking this neo-isolationist kind of movement, but I do think it's kind of blending in a little bit with those who just want more accountability and don't want the administration to really be kind of what it's been marked in all foreign policy issues, risk averse, kind of playing both sides, not having a coherent strategy to get to an end to it.
Okay, well, Josh, Rebecca took off her cynicism hat, but I want to keep the cynicism hat on briefly to elaborate on a point she just made, which is a very sound point, that the Biden administration does kind of want to have it both ways here. They're leaning into the notion that the big obstacle to Ukraine's battlefield victories are Republicans in the House, but it was the Biden administration that spent the first 2 years of this war hemming and hawing before ultimately caving to Ukraine's requests for long-range artillery, HIMARS systems, tanks, cluster munitions, Patriot missile systems, F-16s, ATACMS, our Army tactical missile systems, which has the best initialism of any weapons platform ever. The history books, if they record a disaster for Ukraine here, they will not lay the blame at Marjorie Taylor Greene's feet. They will lay it at Joe Biden's feet. It will be his loss. He will own it. Republicans have little to fear in that sense.
Well, I actually think that the results of the 2024 election will determine who owns the blame or credit, for that matter, when it comes to Ukraine. I think that's going to be the ownership, and that's going to be I think the voter. Not that Ukraine is going to be the biggest issue on the election, but I do think that is going to be a big debating point in the months ahead. Look, I think you're right. I agree wholeheartedly with Rebecca and Noah. You're making the same point that the cautiousness, almost to a point of paralyzing fear, is a defining factor of the Biden administration's foreign policy. And I think we easily forget that moment at the very beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when the instinct in the American the intelligence and national security establishment was to give Zelensky a ride out of Ukraine and to abandon the country to the Russians. I mean, think about remember that moment. That was what the prevailing instinct.
And subsequently, according to Julia Yaffe at Puck's interview with Mike McCall, the Biden administration, from the president on down to Jake Sullivan, genuinely believed that Russia would engage in first use of nuclear weapons, which is just a bizarre misreading of deterrent theory. It makes you wonder if they really understand deterrence. I'm hesitant to even lend that too much credit, because any national security official worth their salt with enough experience under their belt should know that deterrence is a two-way street.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you can even tie what's going on in Ukraine and the cautiousness in that theater with how they're handling Israel and how they're so cautious and worrying to the point of micromanaging Israel's war against Hamas, and literally almost shooting themselves in the foot constantly because they're not really sending a clear message about what the mission is and why this is such an important thing for Americans to be paying attention to. So that has been you're right. I mean, this has been a defining feature of Biden administration foreign policy. And I think it's only undermined them, not just strategically, but also in terms of the political side.
All right. So we're very low on time, but I do want to get to one more story when we're talking about all these flashpoints all over the world. We can't ignore the Pacific. We got some very bad news from the stockyards this week. The U.S. Naval News Institute's media outlet reported that following a Navy audit of their programs to build more ships, the ships we need to deter China in the South China Sea, we have a ton of delays. The new class of guided missile frigates is going to be about 3 years late, according to this audit. The first Columbia-class submarine is projected to be 12 to 16 months late. Virginia-class submarine, 36 to 24 months late. Constellation-class frigate, 18 to 26 months late. And that doesn't take into account the number of attack submarines that we have, which are out of commission just for basic maintenance. And none of this is going to be, these delays aren't going to be resolved anytime soon, at least according to the bureaucratic language that is contained in this report. Rebecca, the Pentagon estimates that China's naval fleet would grow from 395 ships in 2025 to 435 by the end of the decade, in preparation for what defense officials warn is an advance effort on an invasion of Taiwan, perhaps as early as 2027. China has 232 times America's shipbuilding capacity, according to the Office of Naval Intelligence. This is obviously insufficient. There is no will to address this within a time frame that is requisite. Are we just lazily drifting towards a catastrophe here?
I would say it's, this is a choice. So there's a couple of things I get pushback whenever I talk about, it doesn't have to be this way. And people say it does. This is sort of just necessarily the way it is because we don't have the workforce. We have supply chain issues. And so there's really nothing that can be done. No amount of money throwing at the problem will help. I mean, it's simply not true. I mean, this administration, the Biden administration, just every budget, every defense budget it has submitted has been effectively a cut when you account for inflation. And so that is the reality. Then you look at what the Chinese are doing, to your point, now they're just going gangbusters on their own military. They're specifically investing in the kinds of capabilities meant to do the thing that Xi Jinping says he's going to do, which is be the preeminent military power. And that means pushing the United States out of its particular region in the Pacific and then beyond. And so it's very frustrating when you get another audit like this and see, but it's also it's just never a surprise to me because there's been no major change in this administration's approach to the problem. A major change would be saying something like, yes, the biggest problem the United States faces right now is an ascendant Chinese Communist Party that's determined to replace the United States as the preeminent power and to completely undo the post-World War II order of which Americans have prospered and lived safely from through the Cold War and beyond. And right now, they're still saying that the biggest problem facing the country is climate change. And I believe them that they think that because that particular policy continues to undermine what I would suggest the United States should be doing in terms of investing in our national defense and the kinds of approaches we should be taking to the likes of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and the Iranian regime. It'd be totally different if we understood the collaboration between those axes, between those countries that have developed essentially what has become an axis against the United States. So, it's a depressing report that's come out, but nobody should be surprised because we haven't actually seen a decision point to make a change on this, to get industry to make the changes we need to get where we need to be to deter the Chinese.
Josh, so to Rebecca's point there, everybody, let's go back to 2012, the 2012 presidential debates. Everybody remembers Barack Obama's very cynical dig at and the trajectory of which is expected to expand, that we need to throw money at the Navy in perpetuity and reform its culture, its bureaucratic culture, in order to develop the kind of fleet that we need to meet the Chinese threat. It is just so easy to get one over on the press with a good soundbite that makes Republicans sound like fearmongers, myopic, obsessed with China. I have very little confidence that they'll be able to navigate a political environment that will be arrayed against them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of bureaucratic decadence from the sounds of it. And look, the sad reality is voters don't, as illustrated by that 2012 debate, Noah, they don't start paying attention until America is attacked or until America's interests are directly threatened. So
and then they say, why do we have all the ships that we need? Well, this is why.
And look, the terms of cutting aid, I mean, there's been a bipartisan dynamic lately where both Republicans and Democrats don't prioritize the needs of the military, and our military posture has weakened during that same time. So It's something that we see this throughout history. You look at the pre like Pearl Harbor period in the late 30s. I mean, you had the same lack of readiness and lack of understanding that there are threats out there that the U.S. is not well positioned to face. And sadly, it usually takes a catastrophe or something, it requires you to hit rock bottom before people wake up and realize the stakes.
Sobering thought. I thank you very much, both of you, for joining me today. It's been an enlightening conversation, but that's going to do it for us. You have been watching Issues with Noah Rothman on Two-Way. You can find me at nationalreview.com or on X Twitter at Noah C. Rothman. Thank you, Josh Kraushaar. You can follow him at Josh Kraushaar. And Rebecca Heinrichs, you can follow her at RL Heinrichs. Read her work at the Hudson Institute. Read Josh's work at Jewish Insider. And as always, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next week.